if there's a elevator pitch or like a one line thing of what the book is about for me, it's what is the role of art and artists in resisting authoritarianism. So the
Yes.
narrative is that even though Hen March had all these incredible ideals, as the larger culture kind of moves in the other direction, what do the characters do? Like, what do the two poets do in the midst of all that push and pull of culture and politics?
Before the first of the 9 parts of the book, it's prefaced with a memo. There's like a scholarly character here who has composed this memo at the beginning. The signature has been redacted. This is such an intriguing opening. What we know about this nameless character is that they are leading a team that is trying to discover the truth about Gyri. And this character seems almost infuriated that the material that this team needs to work through to get to Gyri is mostly Nari. And so there's this desire, this character, this scholarly character wants to make a great figure of this, the important figure to understand here. We're on a quest to understand Gyri. From our analysis of the source materials, we know that Nari's perspective dominates these documents. So it's almost like it's a problem that we're getting Nari, but what we really want is to go to the source, the authority, the true mentor. It's so interesting that everything is prefaced by this kind of scholarly character who thinks that that is what is important and has perhaps been led to think that by the quote-unquote higher-ups and is aware of having failed at this venture. And at the end of the memo, it ends, "I have learned a great deal while chasing after Gyri. Not enough about Gyri, it would seem, but so much about our world and so much about myself. This collection represents a failure, that is true, my failure, and while the higher-ups might not be able to see anything beyond that, I am starting to wonder whether that is their failure. This inflexibility, this inability to improvise when things don't go exactly as planned." It's a very fitting preface to the book where we have this character who just shows up at the beginning who thinks that they're supposed to be getting to the truth about the one great poet, knows that they haven't succeeded at that, feels this kind of authoritarian pressure to succeed at that, but knows that something else has happened, and that those who can't begin to recognize the value of what this other thing is are missing something, are failing in some way. Could you? I've just been talking about the memo a bunch. What are your thoughts about the memo? Why does the book of poetry begin with this memo? What are your thoughts on this kind of scholarly character? What they think that they're doing?
This is another good example of the content informed thing. So on like a content level, the idea is that this is a character who, again, we don't know the exact timeline. This could be 100 years in the future. It could be 1,000 years in the future. But in some future point, looking back on what happens in the book and trying to piece things together, there's, hints that they're working for some kind of, like basic sci-fi authoritarian government. But on a form level, very simply, I wanted to do exposition. I wanted to have some exposition in a way that was interesting and not just like, this is a classic for like screenwriters or other kinds of writers. You don't want to just tell the audience like, in the year 5277, people are fighting against blah, blah, blah. Like how a movie opens with just the text. And that's usually not the best way to open a movie.
Totally.
Instead, you want to open a movie with like something interesting happening. And so not that this is super interesting. Like you said, it's kind of a scholarly paper or like a researcher just typing out their notes. So it isn't necessarily like an action movie beginning. But my thought was that this could be a way to do some really basic exposition stuff, like one, that this isn't Earth, this is another world, that there are these two characters who are the focus of the book, that Hen March is another character who is kind of a folkloric character. Like all of that stuff is in this prologue, this memo section, but it's all under the kind of formal or conceptual umbrella of this like mysterious thing that's happening. And so again, my hope, and who knows, I could be very wrong, but my hope is that that draws people in. It makes the exposition piece of the book as interesting as the actual like book itself,
Yeah.
or as like the content of the book itself.
It establishes lack of clarity about the timeline and exactly who is who and what the events are as a given. And so we have this character who wants this clarity, and it's established right from the get-go that if we also want that, if we're turning, knowing that this is like a narrative, if we're turning to it wanting to fully grasp what that narrative is and how everything relates, we're not going to get that. And that's important to recognize and value. And even this person who desires to have that is somehow recognizing that we need to feel into the value of something else to appreciate what's going to be communicated to us here.
There's something meta there about, one, I think you hit it on the head around, it's about setting expectations for the reader, that like you're not going to necessarily know everything all the time, and that's okay. Like again, when you're doing like science fiction writing, it's very easy to get caught up in the world building and spend, I mean, not that I'm speaking from experience, but spend months and months and months thinking about like what kind of clothes the people there wear, and like like where did they come from, and how do their spaceships work, and like just those types of questions. And like sometimes you want to look at those details because it helps the world come alive. But then as I think many sci-fi writers will probably tell you, like that can't be a substitute for like an interesting story or like interesting poems or interesting content. And so like a model that I was actually looking at was Avatar: The Last Airbender, the cartoon. If people have ever, not the movie, but the cartoon.
You looked at your arm because Avatar, you have an Avatar tattoo.
In that, like, you know, if you watch that cartoon, you don't necessarily know like why. I mean, yeah, eventually it gets explained later, but like for the original series, so you don't necessarily like why some people have powers and some people don't, and like why some people live here and some people live there. Like you're thrown into the story, and the story goes. And I think that's cool. But then there's also, again, on a meta level, that's something that the book is trying to deal with too, that like comfort with uncertainty, and that comfort with nuance and complexity, that we don't have to have black and white perfect answers to every question in order to be able to grapple with those questions or grow through the process of thinking about those questions. It isn't always just about the one perfect answer. Totally. And so my hope is that kind of primes the reader for stuff that comes later.
Totally.
I mean, even actually, I mean, not to quote myself, but I think the very first actual poem in the book, I don't know if you were going to go here, but the line is, you know, not everything that is real is literal. Not everything that isn't literal isn't real. Don't be angry at a story because it isn't a map. That was actually one of the very last lines that I wrote for the book, even though it's in the first poem. Don't be angry at a story because it isn't a map. Again, coming from the type of work that I do around like narrative and culture shifting, like stories are really, really valuable. But they're not always going to give you all the answers. They're not maps from point A to point B. They're different ways of thinking about information and different ways of thinking about the things that are important to us.
Definitely, yeah. So the memo is fostering suspension of disbelief, which will which prepares the reader to engage with the narrative, but it's also habituating the reader to being with the discomfort of not knowing, not understanding. And that's not just because that's going to be necessary to work through this book, because that just happens to be how the book is, but also because the book has faith, you have faith, that there is something hopeful and culturally crucial, ethically, culturally important about this capacity to hold off trying to make everything make sense, trying to complete the story, because we're very good at doing that. Some important things about the form of the book that are established in that memo are that there are 9 parts, that some of the writing, we believe, I'm quoting the scholarly character now, is transcription of other people's performances at the community gatherings the duo attended during their travels. The clearest example of this are the blessings, words shared by village elders before each event. So there are 9 villages that are visited over the course of the book, 9 corresponding parts. Each part opens with one of these blessings, and each part ends with a section on Hen March.
Mm-hmm.
And this scholarly character recognizes that there's something significant about 9. There's 9 villages, 9 corresponding parts. The number 9 reappears throughout these writings in subtle and not so subtle ways. This feels important, but there is nothing in the text itself that explains the number's significance. One section, the stanzas are called 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 7, 2, 3, 8, 2, 3, 9, 2, 3. So that was really intriguing for me, that the scholarly character doesn't understand. He should notice this pattern that 9 seems to be significant. Helped us have a sense of what to expect from the form. And then I found myself looking out for these subtle and not so subtle references to the number 9. Could you expand on any of that, whether the number 9 or this particular formal structure where each of the 9 parts opens as it does with the blessing and closes as it does with some more narrative about Hen March?
Yeah, that's a really cool question, because again, it gets to the form and the content side a little bit in that I think there's a pretty simple answer, and then there's maybe a deeper answer too. And on a simple kind of process level, it was really important to me in terms of my own process to be able to have sections to work with, so I'm not overwhelmed by here's 100 poems and let's just figure out how they put together. Again, coming from a music background, I love thinking about track lists and what song opens the album, what song closes the album, and then how do you get from one to the other. That's fun for me, and so I thought of it almost as 9 little EPs. If you're going to release 9 EPs, and you had to track list each one of them, and then track list the EPs themselves together, that just made it fun. And again, so for any writers out there, that's a strategy that you can use. And then as for the number 9 itself, again, I don't want to give one specific here's why the number 9 appears. I think part of it was at some point maybe I had 9 Hen March stories, so then I worked backwards and made sure there are 9 blessings and stuff in between, something like that. I don't remember 100%. So some of it was just kind of arbitrary. 9 happened to be the number that made sense for the content of the book. And then there are some other connections too. I think about there's a section in the book which it's very, very, very subtle, and I don't think many people will get it at all, but there's a section that does reference the Wu-Tang Clan, 9 members of the Wu-Tang Clan.
Yes.
And then there's also, again, if people know about hip hop, right? There's a lot about hip hop in this book that, again, is also very subtle, and I think a lot of people aren't going to catch it because you don't see the words hip hop. It takes place in another universe, right? But think about traditionally the 4 elements of hip hop, but then there's also other schools of thought in which there are 9 elements of hip hop. And so that was somewhere in the back of my head, not necessarily as a driving factor of why there are 9 sections, but just as kind of a cool little connection, that there was a nice little symmetry to that, I feel like.
Yes. We'll definitely be delving more into the hip hop connection soon. So given that we will, it'll be, could you remind us what those 9 elements of hip hop?
Oh, you're gonna put me on the spot. So the traditional 4, right? Breaking, graffiti, the DJ, and the MC.
Yes.
The other 5, if I remember, it's street fashion, street entrepreneurialism, so the business side of things, knowledge of self, which is the most important one. I want to say, please, if anyone's watching this and I get this wrong, please don't hate me. It's something that is, there are many that could fit. I think if beatboxing isn't one, it could be one. I think I'm going to say beatboxing. And then I think language, something around slang and language. Yeah.
Let's continue focusing on hip hop and the connection between hip hop culture and the book, because it's so interesting because it is so prevalent, and yet of course there's no hip hop on this moon. When they have an open mic and someone who's learning about the open mic asks, why is it called an open mic? Nobody knows. No, they don't have microphones. So we catch them in the act of hypothesizing why this why this practice that has been inherited is called an open mic. Something I love about the book is that there's this afterword and liner notes, and there's a section in the afterword and liner notes called the cipher, the cycle, the circle, and this is your voice, and you highlight circle imagery pops up throughout the book in both subtle and not so subtle ways. What is the significance of a circle as a symbol? If you're familiar with the role that the cipher plays in hip-hop culture, and if you're not, do some research. I love that. What connections can you make? I love that there are these kind of educational resources at the end, and that you're kind of stepping into a role that is analogous to the role that Nari has at moments in the book, with not arrogance, confidence, like the well-tempered arrogance that I kind of equate with confidence. For me, the importance of there being a gathering of rappers, beatboxers, and/or breakers extemporaneously making music together. So I was doing more research on this cipher to try and kind of go deeper into it, following your prompt. I came across some scholarship from Trisha Rose. Are you familiar with the hip-hop scholar Trisha Rose? So this all seemed very pertinent to me. So I just thought I'd quote a little bit from Trisha Rose and see what you make of the possible connections here. So Trisha Rose was speaking on the effects at the level of style and aesthetics of the cipher, and how these effects suggest affirmative ways in which profound social dislocation and rupture can be managed and perhaps contested in the cultural area. So the effects that she highlighted create and sustain rhythmic motion, continuity and circularity and flow, accumulate, reinforce and embellish this continuity through layering, and manage threats to these narratives by building in ruptures that highlight the continuity as it momentarily challenges it. What do you think about any of that?
That's great. I mean, it's even though I did go to grad school, I wasn't necessarily good at it, and so some of the stuff is like I have to reorient my brain to that way of thinking. But I really like that. I think it definitely connects to how I wanted to think about it in terms of the book, and that like a big project of the book is again pushing back against very binary notions and like black and white thinking and very either or thinking. And I think the cipher is one way of thinking about this larger idea of the conversation and how it's multiple people who are in a circle sharing and contributing to something larger than any one individual contribution, which again, I think is a really important way to push back on how we think about history, how we think about leadership, how we think about power. And then, I mean, the note that Trisha Rose wrote around rupture and kind of the relationship between rupture and continuation is, I hear that in the book in some ways too, which is really cool.
Yeah, there's a bit more too. She speaks of the possibility of treating these hip-hop principles as a blueprint for social resistance and affirmation, creating sustaining narratives, accumulating them, layering, embellishing, and transforming them. However, be also prepared for rupture, find pleasure in it, in fact, plan on social rupture. When these ruptures occur, use them in creative ways that will prepare you for a future in which survival will demand a sudden shift in ground tactics. And for me...
Which also, just relates directly then to that point in the beginning, in the memo around the failure to improvise. I don't know if you were going to say that, sorry.
Yeah, no, we're making the same connection because I think it is central to the book. Well, are you familiar with the storytelling animal? There's a book on the brain and how the brain works called The Storytelling Animal. The stories that we tell about ourselves. On the back of this book, Joseph Capehart, poet and educator, says that you rattle, resist and reimagine the reach and convention of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So I think this book takes it as a given that humans are storytelling animals, that we're telling ourselves stories about ourselves, that there can be power to this, and that, you know, in the cipher there, everyone's encouraged to participate. There's something great, of course, about telling the story. At one point, the characters in one of these panel discussions are debating the merits of telling what you know. And yes, on the one hand, the abstract idea, my story is the story that I should tell, is that there's merit to that. But even in this context, there's concern about that should, and there's concern about pontificating and presenting one piece of abstract advice as universal. There's concern about stories. There's an awareness of how dangerous some of the stories that develop can be, and there's an awareness that as Henmarch recognizes these voices within and develops this capacity to be with those voices and for there to be conversation among those voices. I think that what we're getting at here, what Tricia Rose is helping us to get at here with the idea of, okay, we can have rupture, the voice can be interrupted, the story can be interrupted. In fact, we should plan for it to be interrupted. And then being able to improvise and being able to adapt, having the fluidity that we have in the cipher that we need to maintain. It makes me think of Emergent Strategy too, which is referenced at the end of the book as another book that was useful to you, whether as reads or rereads. The celebration of co-creation and how do we honor that which is emerging co-creatively, breaking away from the model of there being one leader. How are we arrogant or confident enough to remain committed to cultivating and empowering story together, given what we know about the need for humility, because stories take on a life of their own, and there's a lot of damage caused by the storytelling tendency. The brain's capacity is going to be making stories anyway. So what is any of that bringing up for you?
Oh, so much. You're making a lot of really cool connections. Again, this is, I think, the first proper interview that we're doing for this long campaign of promoting this book. And so it's really cool to get to some of this good stuff right away. I guess I think a lot about narrative and counter-narrative, and I think in the context of the Henmarch pieces, where again, this is a historical figure in this world who is loved, and maybe people, I don't know if people build statues of her or whatever, but is also not always listened to. And I think about that in terms of the current conversation around history in the US, particularly around racial justice and racism and white supremacy, and how, again, because we love stories, it's easy to look at a story of like, well, there was slavery and that was bad. And then there was the Emancipation Proclamation and that was good. And then some other stuff happened. And then there was the Civil Rights Movement and that was good. And now we're today and everything's good. And like a cursory knowledge of US history shows that that's all kind of nonsense. That if we don't talk about Reconstruction, if we don't talk about Jim Crow, if we don't talk about current like efforts to roll back things, but it doesn't, but all that nuance and all that complexity doesn't fit into this very neat story that so many of us are told in middle school, in high school, and as adults for a lot of us, right? And so how important it is, I think, again, what the book is attempting to do, and not to do by itself, but attempting to contribute something small to this larger push around acknowledging the power of stories while also encouraging us to always be thinking critically about stories.
Totally.
And always understand how our individual stories fit into or don't fit into larger stories that are being told, whether by the dominant culture or by like subcultures and countercultures at the same time. And that, again, that there's no easy answer. It's just like a constant process of thinking critically about this stuff and asking questions. Like the note that you brought up earlier when Jair is talking to Neri at the end of the book, it's almost all via questions. as opposed to
Yes.
those like authoritative statements about reality.
Yeah. There's a section near the end also called The Writing on the Wall. And here we deal, so this is interestingly just shortly before the reference to Henmarch listening to all the inner voices. My only remaining memory of home, standing in, this is on page 143 by the way, standing in a circle of poets, each echoing an epic larger than ourselves. 8 of us there were, telling stories, bending language around space and time. And then with the importance of the number 9, it's significant that now something kind of goes awry when that pattern is completed, with a 9th poet joined in, as talented as any of us, but whose story was a fountain of fire from his mouth. How people with this or that blood are diluting ours. How people from this or that place should go back. How people who are just like him are just better. How convenient. How old this story echoes, and this voice has a right to exist. This person has a right to be wrong. But we have rights too. And we know what happens when that particular story is allowed to take root. Because history is a circle too. And your fist is a circle too. We know what happens when that particular story is allowed to take root. I think analogously, if we have like a cipher, someone is, participates and reminds me of a section slightly earlier, advice for running an open mic. What if someone spouts a story that is hateful and that is dehumanizing? How do we respond? This person has a right to be wrong. Yeah. What are your thoughts, both on this question and on the way in which this question is being raised as opposed to answered, perhaps?
Yeah, it's like in the book, it's like a story that is happening inside a poem that's happening inside this other story.
Totally.
And so there's a lot of layers going on there. But it reminds me, so like I'm someone who has like in real life has hosted a lot of open mics and a lot of poetry slams and a lot of public events myself. And so it's a very real question that comes up in those spaces. If someone gets up on stage and they start saying something like racist or homophobic or sexist or whatever, like what is the responsibility, one of the hosts, but then 2 of just like the people in the space. And I feel like different spaces have done better and worse in different times with that question. But I think it's an important question because it's not just about open mics and poetry slams, right? It's about the idea of platforming. And I think to bring it back to hip hop, right? I think on one hand, there's the idea of the cipher where lots of people are contributing pieces to it. But hip hop is also, again, in my own experience, like not afraid of confrontation. Right? Not afraid to just tell it like it is and call people out and tell someone to shut up and like get off the stage, right? And I think that those 2 things, again, it's the accountability arrogance thing. They can be in tension with each other, but it's not a complete tension. It's like it's for me a healthy tension. That like, yes, let's invite, like, if I'm hosting an open mic, let's invite everyone to share something, but let's also let them know when you're giving like the spiel at the beginning of the event or between performers or whatever, that like you will be held accountable for what you say here. And that might mean you get booed off stage. That might mean the host comes and unplugs your mic. And so say what you want to say, but be ready for that. And I think that approach has, at least in my experience, worked better than maybe one, like an anything goes approach, which I don't think is healthy, or like a very, very strict, like you can only talk about X, Y, and Z, which I think is just unrealistic. I think that idea of, again, a conversation between all the people who are in the space to build that space into what they want it to be, I think that can work. It's, basic like democracy stuff there too.
Totally.
Right?
Totally. Yeah, I think the anything goes approach can be connected to it. So let's imagine the person who is facilitating the open mic where there is the anything goes approach. There maybe we have the humility without the arrogance. It doesn't matter. Like what I do doesn't matter. It does matter. This person or this collective have decided to curate, and it does matter how that is curated and fostered with intention. That's one of the spades.
Yeah.